Eli Barnett was 13 years old, and every evening he swept the floor of the Hollis Chair and Cabinet Works for $2 a night. He was good at it. He got into the corners the men missed. And the men, 40 of them, stepped over his broom like it was a crack in the concrete. Not one of them ever turned to face him when they spoke. A fever had taken his hearing when he was 4. Nobody in that plant knew how to sign, and nobody tried to learn, so Eli lived inside a great quiet and did the one thing that made the quiet feel like his own. He drew. The night the works burned, 40 men stood out in the gravel lot and watched the sky go orange, and not one of them thought to ask the boy who had been inside. The superintendent, a big smiling man named Vernon Cade, laughed to the deputies while the roof caved in. "The deaf kid?" he said. "He wouldn't know a fire from a sunset." By morning they had a fired worker named Del Hutchins in handcuffs. But Eli had been up in the finishing loft that night, alone, with a pencil stub and a scrap of butcher paper. And while the flames climbed, he had drawn the man with the varnish tin and the match. He drew the whole thing. He just couldn't say a word about it. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you. Before we go on, take 1 second to subscribe, because stories like this one don't survive without you. And in the comments, tell me the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this one travels. Now let's begin. Calder Springs, Ohio, is the kind of town you'd drive through and forget by the next county line. In the autumn of 1968, it was maybe 2,000 souls. A grain elevator, a 5 and dime, a diner with a neon sign that buzzed pink at dusk, and on the north edge, backed up against the rail spur, sat the Hollis Chair and Cabinet Works. 3 stories of brick and old timber that had made kitchen chairs and church pews for 60 years. The whistle blew at 5 every evening. The day men filed out to their trucks. And Eli Barnett filed in. He was a slight boy. Dark hair he cut himself, badly, with the same pocket knife he used to sharpen his pencils. He wore a canvas apron 2 sizes too big, cinched twice around. And he carried a push broom taller than he was. His mother worked the late shift at the county hospital. His father was gone, had been for years, and nobody talked about where. So the $2 a night mattered. It bought bread. It bought the shoes on his feet. But it wasn't the money that made him love the plant. It was the light. In the last hour before dark, the low sun came slanting through the tall west windows and lay down gold across the sawdust. It caught the chrome on the band saws. It turned the amber varnish in the open tins into little pools of honey. Eli would stop sometimes, in the middle of a long sweep, and just look. He looked the way other people listen. It was all he had. And what he saw, he kept. He kept it in his hands. There was a roll of butcher paper up in the finishing loft, the brown waxy kind the meat counter used, and Eli had claimed the end of it. He kept a stub of carpenter's pencil in his apron pocket, worn down to 2 inches, and he sharpened it with the pocket knife until the point was fine as a needle. And when his sweeping was done, he'd climb the loft stairs and draw whatever the day had shown him. He drew faces. That was the strange thing about the boy. He drew the men's faces so true you'd know them across a room. Old Perce with the tobacco pouch of his cheek. The Dooley brothers, near twins, that only Eli could tell apart on paper. He drew the machines too, every hinge and bolt of them, the exact way a chuck key hung on its nail. He drew the plant like he was making a record of a place he expected to lose. Nobody knew how good he was. Nobody ever climbed to the loft to look. Except one. Her name was Nora Coyle, and she taught in the county school, and she was the only adult in Calder Springs who turned her whole body toward Eli when she had something to say. She'd learned to sign from a book, then from a deaf cousin in Columbus. And she was clumsy at it, but she did it. She faced him. Her hands moved and her lips moved together, slow and clear, and for that half hour every afternoon, Eli Barnett was not a fixture in the corner of a room. He was a boy someone was talking to. She'd found his drawings the year before, purely by accident, brought him a proper pencil, and watched his face when she said, out loud and in signs both, that they were good. That they were better than good. He hadn't known what to do with his hands after that. He'd folded them in his lap like they'd done something wrong. "You keep drawing," she told him. "You hear me? You keep every one." He couldn't hear her. But he understood. And he kept every one. Miss Coyle worried about him the way you worry about a thing left out in the weather. She'd sit with the other teachers in the little lounge with the percolator going, and she couldn't help but talk about him. One gray afternoon she was doing just that, half to herself, stirring her coffee. "That Barnett boy," she said. "I gave him a photograph of my grandmother last spring. Just to see. Old photograph, cracked, one I'd had for years." He looked at it, maybe a minute. Handed it back. She shook her head. 2 months later, he draws her. From memory. The exact tilt of her chin. The brooch. Everything. She laughed a little. Tired, that boy remembers a room the way a camera does. Draws a face he saw once. Dead accurate. Months back. It's a gift, and I don't think a single soul in this town but me knows he has it. The other teacher nodded and said something about how sad it all was, and the coffee went cold, and the talk moved on to the football score and the price of heating oil. It was the kind of thing you say and forget. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody thought it mattered. It would matter more than anything anyone said in Calder Springs that whole year. Now, you have to understand how the town handled Eli, because it wasn't cruelty, and that's what made it worse. Cruelty a boy can push against. This was something softer and heavier. It was the habit of not seeing. On Fridays, the foreman paid the men. He'd sit at a plank desk by the loading door with a metal box and a book, and the men lined up, and he'd call each name and hand over the folded bills and look each man in the eye. When Eli's turn came, the foreman signed the ledger, slid $2 bills across the plank, and never once lifted his head. Never called a name he knew the boy couldn't hear anyway. Never looked. Eli learned to reach in from the side, take the money, and go. He'd stopped expecting the man to look up somewhere around his 11th birthday. It was like that everywhere. At the 5 and dime, he set a nickel and a drawing tablet on the glass counter, and the clerk was talking to a woman about church-going, and without breaking her sentence, she waved Eli off with the back of her hand, shooing. The way you shoo a fly, because she'd rung him before and knew he wouldn't argue. He put his nickel down anyway and left it, and took the tablet and walked out. He'd learned that too. If you can't be answered, you can at least be correct. So the boy stopped asking to be understood. That was the thing that happened to him. Slow, over years, and nobody watched it happen. He decided, somewhere down deep where decisions live before you know you've made them, that no grown person was ever going to read his hands or turn his pages, and so he quit trying to be understood at all. He only recorded. That autumn the plant was tight. Orders were down. There was talk of layoffs, the kind of talk that makes men quiet at the lunch pails. And in the second week of October, Vernon Cade laid off Del Hutchins. Del was a Finnish man, one of the best, 40-odd, big through the arms, with a wife named Ruth and 3 kids, and a temper he wore right out front where everyone could see it. Getting cut hit him like a slap. And Del did not take a slap quietly. He'd rode with Cade right there on the floor, in front of everybody. The afternoon it happened. Eli hadn't heard it, of course. But he'd seen it. He'd seen Del's face go dark red, and the cords stand out in his neck. He'd seen Del jab a finger an inch from Cade's chest. He'd seen Cade stand there with that flat, easy smile, hands in his pockets, not giving an inch, which somehow made it worse. Men had to pull Del back. He'd swung his lunch pail against the wall hard enough to dent it, and stormed out into the lot, and everyone in that building had heard him roar that Cade would be sorry, that a man like Cade always got what was coming. Everyone heard it. That was the trouble. 40 witnesses to Del Hutchins swearing the superintendent would be sorry. Eli watched it all from the corner with his broom, unnoticed, the way he watched everything. And he saw something the shouting men didn't. He saw that while Del raged and pointed and everyone's eyes were on Del, Vernon Cade was calm. Not calm like a man holding his temper, calm like a man reading the last page of a book he'd already finished. Eli didn't have a word for it. But he saw it, and later, up in the loft, he drew Cade's face from that afternoon. The flat smile, the still eyes. He didn't know why, he just knew it was a face worth keeping. There was something else Eli saw that week that the men didn't, because the men had no reason to be in the finishing loft after dark, and Eli did. Up in the loft, along the back wall, past the varnished shelves, there was a row of long green ledger books that belonged to the plant office. Payroll books, cost books. The dull spine lettered records of 60 years of chairs. They'd always lived downstairs in the office. But that week, Eli had come up to draw and found them moved, stacked, on the low shelf right next to the 5-gallon tins of finish. He'd thought it was strange for exactly 1 second. Then he'd gone on to his paper, because a 13-year-old sweeper does not question why the superintendent moves the account books, and because it was not his to question, and because no one had ever once asked Eli Barnett what he thought about anything at all. Vernon Cade had stacked those books there himself. Eli had watched him do it, from the far end of the loft, in the last of the evening light, and Cade had not seen the boy. Because who counts a deaf child? Who thinks the furniture is watching? Cade had his reasons, and they were old and deep. For years he'd been skimming. A little off the payroll here, a supplier's kickback there, figures shaded in those green books, until they added up to a number that would send him to the state penitentiary if a real auditor ever sat down with them. And that autumn, with orders down and the owner talking about bringing in an accountant from Cleveland, Vernon Cade had done the arithmetic on his own life. The plant carried a fire policy, $175,000. Burn the works, burn the books, collect the check. Blame it on a hothead everyone had just watched threaten him in front of 40 men. He'd even fired Del early, on purpose, to plant the motive where the whole floor could see it. It was a tidy plan. It had only one flaw, and the flaw was sweeping the floor for $2 a night, and Vernon Cade had already decided that flaw was blind. It happened on a Thursday. The evening came down soft and gold, the way October evenings do in Ohio, and the whistle blew, and the day men went home. Eli started his sweep on the ground floor and worked his slow way up. By the time he climbed to the finishing loft, the sun was almost gone, and the tall windows had gone from gold to a deep bruised rose. He liked the loft best at that hour. It was high and quiet, and the quiet up there felt bigger than the quiet everywhere else, and that was fine with him, because he'd never known any other kind. He was sweeping the far end when the light changed. He felt it before he understood it, the way you feel a door open behind you. A shadow crossed the boards. Eli turned, the way he always turned, watching, and there in the near dark of the loft was Vernon Cade. Cade did not see him. Cade had no reason to look for anyone, because the plant was empty, because the deaf boy did not count. Because a man about to do a terrible thing does not scan the rafters for the one witness God saw fit to make silent. Cade moved with purpose, and in his hands he carried a 5-gallon tin. Eli knew the tin. He knew every tin in that plant. The house finish, the good stuff Hollis used, came in tins with a green band. This one was different. This one had a bright label, a red rooster on it, Ambrose brand, the cheap volatile spirit varnish the plant didn't even stock, the kind of thing that went up like a struck match. Eli knew it didn't belong on that shelf. He knew it the way you know a wrong note in a song you can't hear. And out of pure reflex, standing frozen in the shadows, his eyes did what they always did. They memorized it. The Red Rooster. The dented seam down the left side of the can where it had been dropped once. Every bit of it burned in. Cade set the tin down by the green ledger books. He pried the lid. And he poured. Eli watched him slosh the spirit varnish across the account books, up the wall, out along the boards, in the failing light, thorough and unhurried, a man doing a chore. The smell would have been enormous. Eli couldn't smell fear, but he could see it in himself, feel his own heart, going like a fist on a door. He shrank back into the dark, and he did not run. Not yet. Because some deep animal part of him knew that movement is what the eye catches, and he had spent his whole life learning to be the thing the eye slides past. Cade took something from his coat. A folded book of matches. He tore one free. He struck it. The flame was small, and then it was not small at all. It ran along the wet boards faster than a man could walk, blue at first, then yellow. Then a wall of it climbing the ledger shelf, and the heat came off it in a wave Eli felt on his face across the whole length of the loft. Cade did not stay to watch it grow. He was already moving, already going down the near stairs, quick and light, a man leaving a room he'd finished with. And Eli Barnett, 13 years old, alone in a burning building that no one knew he was in, did the only thing he had ever known how to do with a terrible thing. He drew it. He dropped to his knees at the west window, where the last light still held. He had the butcher paper. He had the pencil stub. And with the fire roaring silent behind him, throwing his own shadow huge across the glass, he drew the man. He drew Cade bent to the tin. He drew the red rooster on the can and the dent in the seam. He drew the arm coming back with the match, the coat, the boots, the hand. His pencil flew. He was crying, and he didn't know it. He drew like the drawing was the only thing keeping the floor under him, and in a way it was, because it kept him from freezing, kept him a boy with a job instead of a boy about to die. Then the heat cracked a window somewhere, and a gust of it rolled across the loft, and Eli understood, all at once, that he had to go. He rolled the paper. He jammed the pencil in his apron. And he ran for the fire stairs at the loft's cold end, the iron ones bolted to the outside brick, the ones the men used for smoke breaks. He hit the bar, and the door gave, and he was out into the night air, coughing, the metal steps ringing under his feet that he couldn't hear ring, down and down along the outside of the building, while the top floor lit up behind the glass like a jack-o'-lantern. He came off the bottom step into the gravel lot and fell, and got up, and kept going, until he was clear, out by the rail spur. And only then did he turn and look at what he'd escaped. The whole top of the Hollis chair and cabinet works was on fire. By the time the truck came from town, half the plant was gone, and the men had come, the way men come to a fire, from their suppers and their porches, 40 of them and more, standing in the gravel with the orange light on their faces. Somebody's wife had a coffee thermos going. The deputies rolled up, and the men stood and watched 60 years of chairs burn down to a red glow, and they talked in the low voices men use at fires, and not one of them looked at the small figure standing apart at the edge of the lot with a roll of butcher paper clutched to his chest and soot on his face. Not one of them thought, that boy sweeps up there in the evenings. Not one of them thought to count him, to ask him, to face him. Vernon Cade thought of him. Cade had come back, of course. A superintendent comes to his own fire. He stood with the deputies, and Eli, from across the lot, watched him do the most astonishing thing. He watched Cade laugh. He watched that flat, easy smile break across his face while the works burned, and he watched Cade's mouth make words to the deputies, and Eli couldn't hear them. But he read them off the man's lips the way he read everything, and the words were these. The deaf kid? He wouldn't know a fire from a sunset. The deputies chuckled. And that was it. That was the whole of the town's interest in the only person who had been inside the building. A superintendent's joke. The boy dismissed in a single breath, blind because he was deaf. The two things melted into one in the mind of a man who needed him to be nothing. Eli stood there, holding the truth rolled up in his hands, soot in his lungs, watching the one man who knew he was innocent tell a lie so smooth the whole town swallowed it standing up. He wanted to show them. Even then, God help him, he wanted to. He took a step toward the deputies with the roll half lifted, and a fireman's arm came across and moved him back out of the way, gentle, not even a glance, the way you move a child from a doorway, and the moment passed, and Cade was already turning to shake a deputy's hand, and Eli lowered the paper and understood. Again, the thing he'd understood his whole life. There was no one to show it to. Not tonight. He walked home in the dark with the fire glow behind him, and he did not sleep. By morning, they had Del Hutchins. It was almost too easy for them, and that's how you know a frame is good, when it's easy. Del had rode with Cade in front of 40 men. Del had sworn Cade would be sorry. Del had no alibi worth the name, home alone, wife visiting her sister 2 counties over. And in the bed of Del's pickup, where a Finnish man will always have such a thing, sat a can of solvent. That was enough. In Calder Springs, in the autumn of 1968, that was more than enough. The deputies came to his door before he'd had his coffee and led him out in cuffs, while Ruth Hutchins stood on the porch with a baby on her hip and her mouth open and no sound coming out. The town made up its mind that same day. You could feel it settle over the place like weather. Del Hutchins burned the Hollis Works. Everybody knew it. Hadn't they heard him? Hadn't they seen his face? A man like that, hot like that, out of work, sore. Of course he did it. The town wanted its story simple, and it had one. And a simple story is the hardest thing on earth to argue a boy out of, when the boy can't even speak. Eli went into town that morning with the drawing. He had thought about it all night. He knew, in his careful recording way, that what was on his paper mattered. He didn't have the words for evidence or witness or perjury, but he knew the man on his paper was Cade, and he knew the whole town had just handed Cade's crime to Del, and he knew, the way a boy knows a wrong sum, that this was wrong, and could be made right if only someone would look. He found a deputy outside the courthouse, a young one, leaning on the fender of a county car with a paper cup of coffee. Eli walked right up to him. This was a brave thing, braver than anyone watching would ever have credited, because Eli had learned 100 times over that walking up to grown men got you shooed and stepped over. But he did it. He unrolled the paper. He held it up. He pointed at the face on it, at Cade, and he pointed hard, tapping the paper, tapping his own eye, tapping the paper again, his whole small body straining to say the thing he had no voice to say. I saw. I was there. This man. This one. The deputy looked down at him and smiled. It was a kind smile. That was the worst of it. He reached out and ruffled Eli's hair, the way you'd tousle a nice dog, and he said something Eli caught only the shape of. Something like, "There you go, son." And he took the paper, folded it, without looking at what was on it, and slid it into his own back pocket the way you pocket a flyer somebody hands you on the street. Then he turned back to another deputy and went on with his conversation, and Eli stood there with his hands empty, and his truth folded up in a stranger's hip pocket. Dismissed. Again, so gently it didn't even look like cruelty. He'd drawn it twice. He would learn to be grateful for that. But standing there that morning, watching his page disappear into a pocket that would never open it, Eli Barnett felt the last of something go out of him, the last belief that any of them would ever look. Almost the last. There was still one adult in Calder Springs who faced him when she spoke. He walked the mile to the school. It was Saturday, but Miss Coyle graded on Saturdays. He knew that, and her car was there, and the side door was open. He went down the empty hall past the cold radiators and the smell of chalk and floor wax, and he found her at her desk, under the tall windows, with a red pencil in her hand and stacks of paper all around her. She looked up, and unlike every other adult in that town, when Nora Coyle looked up and saw Eli Barnett standing in her doorway, with soot still in the creases of his knuckles, and his eyes red-rimmed, and his mouth working, she stopped everything. She put the pencil down. She turned her whole body toward him, her chair scraping around, and she gave him her hands, and her face, and her full attention, the way she always had. "Eli," she signed, slow, "what is it? What's wrong?" He couldn't sign fast enough. His hands tangled, so he did the thing he trusted more than his hands. He came to her desk, and he swept the graded papers aside, and he laid down his second drawing, the copy, the one from memory he'd made in the night, flat on the wood in front of her. And he tapped it, and he waited to be faced. And believed. Nora Coyle bent over the page. For a moment she just took in the skill of it, because you couldn't not, the wall of flame rendered in nothing but pencil, the ledger shelf, the whole loft in the boy's precise, terrible hand. And then she saw the man. Bent to the tin. Match drawn back. And she knew that face. Everyone in the county knew that face. She had shaken that hand at the church supper. She went white. The color went out of her lips. "Eli," she signed, and her hands were not steady now. "Eli, where were you Thursday night?" He pointed at the drawing. At the loft window in the corner of it, where he'd drawn the very glass he'd crouched behind. He pointed at himself. He pointed at the fire. He was there. He saw it. His hands said it as plain as hands can say anything. She looked back at the page. And now she looked at it the way you look at a thing you know is going to change your life. She saw that the boy had drawn it exact. That was the gift the whole town had thrown away, wasn't it? That was the thing she'd said over cold coffee and no one had cared. That this boy remembered a room the way a camera does, dead accurate, months back. And here was a room he'd seen 4 nights ago, and every line of it would be true. She knew it would be true. Her eye went to the can. It was drawn to the seam. A 5-gallon tin with a rooster on the label, and down the left side of it a dent, a crease in the metal so specific that Miss Coyle understood. Cold all through her, that the boy had not invented this. You do not invent a dent. This was not the house varnish. She knew the plant used the green band finish. This was something else, brought in, and the boy had drawn the exact dent in the exact can that had no business on that shelf, and if that can was ever found in the ash, it would be found dented, right where Eli said. And no story the town told itself could explain how a deaf child had drawn a detail he could only have seen with his own eyes in that room on that night. "This can," she signed, tapping it. "You saw this can. He carried this can." Eli nodded so hard it hurt, and Miss Coyle sat down slowly in her chair, because her legs had gone, and she pressed her fingers to her mouth. And she looked from the page to the boy and back, and she understood the full and awful shape of what she was holding. She understood that the wrong man was in a cell across town with a wife and 3 children on a porch. She understood that the right man was being clapped on the back this very morning as a poor superintendent who'd lost his plant to a hothead. And she understood that the only witness God had put in that loft was a 13-year-old boy the whole town had spent years learning not to see. A boy who could not be sworn, could not testify, could not say a single word, but who could draw. She looked closer, and she found the second thing. Down at the bottom of the page, small, where the drawn man's foot came down on the boards. Eli had drawn the boots, and the near boot was turned just enough that you could see the heel. And the heel was worn. Not worn all over the way a man's heels wear, worn hard on the outside edge, run down at a slant, the way only certain men walk. Miss Coyle knew Del Hutchins. Del was a flat-footed man, heavy and square. Del did not walk on the outsides of his heels, and never had. Whoever wore that boot, whoever stood in that loft and poured that spirit and struck that match, walked with his weight rolled to the outside. And it was not Del Hutchins. And the boy had drawn it without even knowing what he'd caught, because Eli drew everything, whether he understood it or not. Two things. In one page. The can that didn't belong, and the heel that wasn't Del's. "Oh, Eli," she signed, and her hands were shaking outright now. "Oh, you clever, clever boy. Do you know what this is? Do you have any idea what you've drawn?" He didn't quite, but he saw her face, and for the first time in his life, an adult was looking at his page, and not looking away, and something in his chest. Some door that had been closing for 9 years stopped closing. Then Miss Coyle's face changed again, and the joy went out of it, and the fear came back, and Eli saw that too. Because she knew this town. She knew what her word was worth against Vernon Cades. Nothing. She was a county school teacher who knew sign language. And she was going to walk into the sheriff's office and say that the deaf boy everyone stepped over had watched the superintendent burn down the plant, and that she knew because he'd drawn it. She could hear how it would sound before she said it. She could see the kind smiles, the ruffled hair, the folded page in the back pocket. She had the truth on her desk, in pencil, exact to the dent in the can. And she had no way on God's earth to make the law look at it. She reached out, and she took Eli's soot-stained hands in both of hers, and she held them, and she made him look at her, and she signed the only thing she was sure of. "They're going to try Del Hutchins," she signed, fast, and this, she touched the page, "this is the only thing that can stop it. But nobody will listen to me. And nobody will listen to you." Her hands stilled. "So I have to find somebody whose job it is to look." Eli watched her hands. He watched her stand, and gather the drawing careful as a live coal, and reach for her coat. And what neither of them knew yet, that gray Saturday morning in the empty schoolhouse, was that across the county the machinery had already started to turn against Del Hutchins. And it was turning fast. The arraignment was set. The grand jury was being called. In 9 days, 12 men who had already made up their minds would sit down in a room and hand up an indictment. And after that a boy's drawing would be a very hard thing to put in front of anyone at all. 9 days, a page of pencil, a boy no one would face, and a woman no one would believe. The clock had started, and it was already running out. Monday came gray and cold, and Eli Barnett did a thing he had never done before. He did not go to school. He did not go to the burnt lot where the men still poked at the ruins. He put the drawing flat inside his shirt, against his chest, where no wind could take it. He buttoned his coat over it. And he started walking. The county courthouse annex sat 2 miles out the Milford Road. Eli knew the way. He had drawn that road once. Every fence post, the leaning barn, the culvert where the water ran orange. He walked it now with his head down and his broom-thin arms wrapped around himself, and he did not hear the one truck that passed him, and the driver did not stop. 2 miles is a long way for a boy of 13. His shoes were thin. By the time the low brick building came up out of the fields, his feet had gone past cold into a kind of nothing. He stood at the door a moment. Then he went in. There was a man at a desk in a back room. Papers everywhere. A window gone gray with soot from 100 cases. The nameplate said Ward Ellison, and under it, smaller, the words that meant nothing to Eli but everything to the town: State Fire Marshal, Field Investigator. Ellison looked up. He saw a boy. Soot on his sleeves, a queer stillness to him, eyes too steady. "You lost, son?" Eli didn't answer. Eli couldn't. He crossed the room, and he took the folded paper from inside his shirt, warm from his own body, and he laid it on the desk in front of the tired man. And then he did the thing Miss Coyle had taught him. He stepped back, and he stood, and he waited to be faced. Ellison almost brushed him off. He had a stack of 100 pages that said Del Hutchins burned the Hollis Works, and a grand jury coming, and a headache. He glanced at the drawing the way a busy man glances at anything a child hands him. Then he stopped glancing. Because the boy had drawn the origin point, the exact origin point, the low shelf against the north wall of the finishing loft, where the burn pattern spidered out in a way Ellison had looked at for 4 days and could not make fit the story. Del Hutchins was supposed to have splashed solvent by the loading door and run. But the char didn't start at the loading door. It started at that shelf, the one thing in the whole clean case against Del that had kept Ward Ellison awake. And here was a child's pencil showing him a man pouring a tin at that exact shelf. "Where'd you get this?" Ellison said. Then, seeing the boy's eyes on his mouth and nowhere else, he said it slower, and Eli only watched and gave nothing back. Ellison understood then. He'd worked the county long enough. He picked up his phone, and he made a call, and inside the hour Nora Coyle came through the door with her coat half-buttoned and her breath short from hurrying. "His name is Eli Barnett," she said. "He's deaf. He's been deaf since he was 4. And he was in that loft the night it burned. What followed took the rest of that Monday and most of the light in the sky." Ellison did not trust the drawing. That was his job, not to trust. So he tested the boy. He got out a tray of things a plant might hold, tins of a dozen makes, a handful of tools, photographs of faces, plant men and strangers mixed together. He laid them out, and through Miss Coyle's hands he asked Eli to point. Which can was on the shelf. Eli's pencil never wavered. He didn't point to a tin at all. He pulled his butcher paper close, and he drew it. 5 gallons. A red rooster on the label, the word Ambrose, and a dent in the left seam, low, the kind a can gets when it's been dropped once and kept anyway. Ellison went very still. Because the plant didn't stock Ambrose. He'd checked the supply room himself, walked the shelves with the clerk's book. Hollis bought a cheaper brand by the barrel. There was no Ambrose spirit varnish anywhere in that building's records, and yet the boy had drawn one, down to a dented seam, sitting at the very shelf where the fire was born. "Ask him," Ellison said. And his voice had changed. "Ask him about the man's hands." Miss Coyle turned her whole body to the boy, the way she always did, and her fingers moved. Eli watched. Then he bent to the paper again. He drew a book of matches, folded, half the matches gone, and on the cover, in his careful stub pencil letters, he could copy any shape he'd seen, even letters he couldn't sound. 2 words. Blue Larkspur. Ellison sat back in his chair like a man pushed. "The Blue Larkspur," he said, "is a tavern. Across the county line, 20 minutes past the bridge." He looked at Miss Coyle. "Vernon Cade drinks there 3 nights a week. Everybody knows it. It's the only place a plant man of his kind can drink without half the church seeing him do it." He tapped the drawn matchbook. "Del Hutchins has never been across that county line in his life. He's a hardshell Baptist. His wife will swear to it, and so will the preacher." The room had gone quiet in a new way, the kind of quiet where a thing that was fixed comes loose. But Eli wasn't finished. He was watching Ellison's face, and something in it, belief, maybe, the first belief he'd seen from any grown man, made him bold. He turned back to his own drawing, the one that had crossed 2 miles against his chest, and he touched the setter's hand where it held the match. He touched the smallest finger. And he tapped it, hard, twice, so they would look. Miss Coyle bent close over the page. On the pinky of the drawn hand, small as a grain of rice but there, unmistakable, Eli had drawn a ring. A flat-faced ring. A signet, Cade wears a signet, she whispered, on his little finger. I've watched him sign report cards with that hand. I've watched him tap it on a counter, waiting to be served first. She straightened, and her eyes were wet and bright and furious all at once. He wears it every single day. Ellison stood up. He walked to the window and back. And then he asked Miss Coyle to do something, and she took a breath and did it. She read the whole page aloud, out of the boy's hands and into words, so that Ward Ellison could hear the truth spoken for the first time. She named the tin. The Ambrose rooster, the dented seam, standing where no such can was stocked. She named the matchbook, Blue Larkspur, from a tavern the accused man had never seen, and the superintendent knew by heart. She named the boot, she'd caught it herself, the first night, the outer heel worn down, a wear that wasn't Dell's. She named the ring on the smallest finger. And last she named the shelf, the north wall shelf, where the green ledger books had been stacked in against the varnished tins, the books full of 6 years of a payroll skimmed thin, waiting to burn. She read it all, and when she was done the room was so still you could hear the soot settle. "That's not a picture of Dell Hutchins," Ellison said finally. "That's a signed confession. It just isn't signed by the man they arrested." That was Monday. On Wednesday, the machinery that had been turning against Dell Hutchins turned, for one bad hour, back toward the boy. Vernon Cade heard about it the way men like Cade always hear things, sideways, at the tavern, from a deputy loose in his talk. "A picture," the man said. "Some picture the marshals got now. And a name in it. Your name, Vern." Cade laughed it off at the bar. But he didn't finish his drink. He drove back to the plant office that night, to the little room off the burnt shell that hadn't gone up, and he went through his desk with the door locked. And there, in the second drawer, he found it. A drawing. Him at the shelf, the tin pouring, the match struck. He stood there under the one bulb, and he looked at the thing that could hang him, and his hands started to shake. Then he tore it up. He tore it into pieces the size of stamps, and he tore those in half again, and he opened the little stove, and he fed them in and watched them curl. He drove home almost easy. He thought he had killed it. He thought there had been one page, and now there was none. He did not know that the boy had made 3. That one lay in a deputy's back pocket, forgotten, unread. That one sat on Miss Coyle's desk, under a schoolbook. And that the third, the one he'd just burned, didn't matter at all, because the boy who drew it carried the whole scene inside his head, complete, and could set it down again in 20 minutes, any morning of any week. For the rest of his life. Cade had burned a copy. He thought he'd burned the truth. That was the last easy night he had. The grand jury clock ran down to 2 days, and then Ward Ellison stopped it. He walked into the county attorney's office with the boy's drawing and the supply room's own record book and a cast he'd pulled of the boot print at the origin shelf. And he laid them out, and he would not leave. It took him most of the day and part of his reputation, but by evening the indictment against Dell Hutchins had been held, and a new name had gone quietly to the same 12 men, and the machinery, grinding, reluctant, 60 years set in one direction, began to turn the other way. But Vernon Cade had money, and money buys a lawyer, and the lawyer he bought was a smooth gray man named Prentice, who wore a good coat and never raised his voice. And Prentice had one move, and he made it early. He stood up in Judge Farrow's courtroom before the trial had rightly started, and he moved to bar the drawing. All of it. The tin, the matchbook, the ring, the shelf. Every line of it. "Your Honor," Prentice said, gentle as a man reasoning with a friend, "the state proposes to convict a leading citizen of this county on the strength of a picture. A picture drawn by a child who cannot be sworn, for he cannot speak an oath. A child who cannot be cross-examined, for how does my learned friend put a question to a boy who cannot hear it, and how does that boy answer? He is deaf. He is mute. He has never in his life said a single word that any court could take down." Prentice spread his soft hands. "This is not evidence. This is a fantasy in pencil. And to send a man to a state farm on the imaginings of a deaf-mute child of 13, why, there isn't a court in this land that would allow it." He sat down. And for a long, terrible beat, it worked. Judge Farrow was an old man. He had sat on that bench 30 years, and he did things by the book, because the book was all that had ever kept the strong from eating the weak in a county like this one. And the book did not have a clean page for a boy who couldn't be sworn. The judge looked down at Eli, sitting small beside Miss Coyle, hands folded, watching every mouth in the room and understanding none of the words leaving them. And the judge's face was troubled. Out in the hall, through the tall doors, Ruth Hutchins heard the drift of it. Dell's wife, who had stood on her own porch with a baby on her hip and watched them take her husband away in cuffs. She'd come every day. And when the word slid out to her that the picture might not be let in, that Dell's indictment might stand after all, her legs went, and she sat down hard on the hall bench and put her face in her hands and made a sound nobody in that hall will forget. Everything hung there. A boy who had never spoken, waiting to be heard. A man with 3 kids waiting to be freed or hanged on whether the law would look at a page. Then Judge Farrow leaned forward, and he asked Ward Ellison to approach, and he asked him a plain question. "If I keep the child's picture out," the judge said, "have you got a case standing on its own 2 legs?" And Ward Ellison said, "Your Honor, I've got the case in the ground and in the ash. The picture just tells you where to dig. Let me lay the proof on that rail, and you can decide for yourself whether a boy drew a fantasy or drew exactly what happened." Judge Farrow looked at him a long moment. Then he looked at the drawing. Then he made the ruling that turned it all. "The picture is not sworn testimony," he said, "and it will not go to the jury as testimony. But it may be used as a map. Mr. Ellison may lay his physical proofs beside it, item by item, and the jury may judge whether the map and the ground agree. And if the state's investigator wishes the boy to make a drawing here, in this room, where we can all watch his hand, I'll allow that too. A man may draw. There's no oath on a pencil." His old eyes went hard. "Proceed." Prentice opened his mouth. Then he shut it. He'd lost the motion, and every man on that jury saw him lose it. And Ward Ellison went to work. He took the stand himself, tired and plain in his one good suit, and he did not raise his voice once. He set a long table by the jury rail, and one at a time, slow, he brought the proofs up out of a box and laid them down. And beside each one Miss Coyle held the boy's drawing open to the matching line. First the tin. He set it on the rail, the real one, pulled from the burn origin, scorched black but the label still there under the char. A rooster. The letters Ambrose, half readable. And low on the left seam, a dent. "Recovered," Ellison said, "from the exact shelf the fire started at. A brand this plant never once bought." He nodded to Miss Coyle. She turned the drawing. The same tin, the same rooster, the same dent in the same seam, drawn weeks before anyone dug the real one out of the ash. A juror in the front row leaned forward and did not lean back. Then the matchbook. Ellison held it up in the light. What the fire had left of it. A burnt cover, but 2 words still legible along the fold. "Blue Larkspur." "Found in the origin debris," he said. And then, mild as milk, he called the tavern keeper of the Blue Larkspur to the stand, an honest heavy man who twisted his hat in his hands, and said, yes, he knew Vernon Cade, knew him well, 3 nights most weeks, that was his booth by the window. And Dell Hutchins? The man squinted at Dell, sitting pale at the defense table, and shook his head slow. "Never seen him in my life. Not once. I'd remember." The jury looked at the matchbook. Then they looked at Cade. Then the ledgers. Ellison brought up what the fire hadn't finished: charred green boards, pages fused, but figures still standing in the margins where the flame had run out of air. He read them into the record, slow, figure by figure. 6 years of a payroll. Names of men paid one wage on the working book and a lower wage in truth, and the difference sliding off somewhere it shouldn't. He totaled it where the jury could follow. And then he set beside it the insurance policy on the Hollis Works, and he read the number on that too. $175,000. Burn the books, Ellison said quietly, and you burn 6 years of theft. Collect the policy, and you're paid $175,000 for the favor. That's motive. That belongs to the man who kept these books. It has never once belonged to Del Hutchins, who swept nothing and signed nothing and was let go 2 weeks before the fire. Then the bootcasts. 2 of them, side by side on the rail. One pulled from the varnish-soaked floor at the origin shelf, a heel worn hard to the outside edge, a man who walked on the sides of his feet. The other taken from Del Hutchins's own truck. Ellison held them up together so the jury could see. They did not match. They didn't come close. The man who poured that tin, Ellison said, walked on the outsides of his heels. Mr. Hutchins doesn't. You can look. And then he came to the last thing, and the last thing was in the room. Ellison turned, unhurried, and he looked at Vernon Cade sitting at the defense table in his good coat. And he looked at Cade's hands. There's one item I couldn't put in a box, Ellison said. The boy drew a ring, on the little finger of the hand that struck the match. A flat-faced signet ring. And every head in that courtroom turned toward Vernon Cade, and Vernon Cade, without thinking, without one thought in his head but the animal one, slid his right hand off the table and into his lap, and closed his other hand over it. The whole room saw him do it. You could feel it move through the benches like wind through wheat. 200 people, and every one of them saw the plant superintendent hide his own hand. Let the record show, Ellison said softly. The defendant just covered his ring. Prentice was on his feet, but there was nothing to say, and he said a version of nothing, and sat. That was when Judge Farrow made good on the second half of his ruling. He looked down at the boy who had walked 2 miles with the truth against his chest, and he said, Mr. Ellison, you asked to let the child draw. Let him draw. They brought a board and clipped a fresh sheet of butcher paper to it and set it in the well of the court, in the open space between the tables where the whole room could see. And Miss Coyle knelt beside Eli and turned her whole body to him and signed one thing, slow and clear. Draw the man you saw at the shelf. Draw his face. Eli looked at her. Then he looked out at the courtroom, at all those faces turned toward him. Turned toward him, at last, the whole town's eyes on the boy they had stepped over for years, and he did not shrink. He took his stub pencil, the one he sharpened with a pocket knife, and he set it to the paper. And he drew. The room did not breathe. He worked the way Miss Coyle had told them he worked, like a camera, like the scene was still in front of him and he was only tracing it. The line of a jaw, set of a heavy brow, a particular mouth, thin, pulled down at one corner. The eyes came last, the way eyes always did for Eli, and when the eyes came, the face woke up on the paper and looked out at the courtroom. And it was a face everyone in Calder Springs knew. It was Vernon Cade. The gasp went up all at once, 200 people at once, and Ruth Hutchins in the 3rd row pressed both hands to her mouth. Ward Ellison stepped down toward the defense table. He wasn't loud. He almost never was. The boy who couldn't hear a single word you said, he told Vernon Cade, watched every move you made, and he drew you holding the match. And Cade broke, not into tears. Cade wasn't the kind to weep. He broke into talk, the worst thing a guilty man can do, and he couldn't stop himself. He came half up out of his chair. That's a child's scribble, you can't, nobody could see that far in the dark. The loft was. And there he stopped. Because he had just told a room full of people how much he knew about what a witness could or couldn't have seen from the loft. He had just placed himself inside the size of the room and the dark of the night no innocent man would have measured. Prentice had a hand on his sleeve, pulling, but it was far too late. Cade stood there, with his mouth open, and the whole town watching, and the last thing on his face was the thing that had brought him down from the start, the sure, stupid certainty that the deaf boy wouldn't know a fire from a sunset. The deaf boy had known. The deaf boy had drawn him striking the match. The bailiff moved. Judge Farrow's gavel came down, and the case that had been built to hang Del Hutchins in 9 days came apart in a single afternoon. Then, one by one, the reckonings. Del Hutchins was discharged at the rail. The judge said the words plain, the charges against him were dismissed, and he was a free man, and the court owed him an apology it had no lawful way to pay. Del stood up slow, like a man who's been braced for a blow so long he doesn't trust it's not coming. His wife reached him first. But it was what Del did next that the town talked about after. He crossed the well of the court, and he got down, a grown man, 40 years old, down on both knees on the courtroom floor, so that he was below the boy's height, looking up, so Eli could see his whole face. And he signed, clumsy, the only sign Miss Coyle had time to teach him in that moment. Thank you. Over and over. Thank you. Vernon Cade went the other way. The jury was out barely long enough to fill their coffee, and they came back and said the word, and Judge Farrow handed down the sentence. Cade would go to the State Farm, 60-odd miles north, and the ledgers Ellison had pulled from the ash went into the record permanent, figure by figure, the 6 years of skim and the $175,000 policy he'd meant to collect off the fire. They read it all out loud. Then they let him out a side door, and his good coat didn't help him one bit. And he did not look at the boy on the way past. He couldn't. There was the deputy, too, the one who had taken Eli's first drawing outside the courthouse and ruffled his hair and put the page in his back pocket without a glance. Ellison had tracked that page down. It had ridden in the man's uniform for days, forgotten, creased soft. And in open court, quiet, without cruelty, but without letting him off either. Ellison made him bring it out and hand it to the bench. The deputy's face was red as a barn. He set the boy's first drawing on the rail with the rest of the proof, and he said, low, that he was sorry he hadn't looked. It wasn't much. But the whole town watched a lawman say he should have looked at the deaf boy's page, and that was something the deaf boy had never gotten before. And there was the foreman, the man who used to sign Eli's $2 pay each Friday without once turning his head. He found the boy in the crowd after, in the crush by the doors. He stood in front of him a moment, awkward, a big man who worked with his hands and had never in his life been taught what Eli's hands could say. Then he did his clumsy best. He turned his whole body, the way he'd seen Miss Coyle do it, and he raised his rough hands, and slow, wrong, and trying, he signed the words she must have shown him in a hurry that same hour. Thank you. Eli watched him get it half right, and Eli, who drew everything and gave back almost nothing, nodded. The town that had stepped over the boy's broom for 6 years stood in the courthouse and looked at him. All of them. At last. And before the week was out, they had taken his fire loft drawing, the man, the tin, the match, and framed it, and hung it in the courthouse hall, where every soul who came for a deed or a license would have to stop and see what the quietest person in Calder Springs had been able to see. 6 months on, in the second week of a soft spring, the light came honey-colored through the window of the diner on Main Street. Eli Barnett sat in a booth by the glass. He was still thin, still quiet, still deaf, that the fever had taken and would never give back. But he sat where the light was best, and the men at the counter when they came in off their shift, lifted a hand to him. And when they had something to say to him, they came to the booth and they turned their whole bodies and faced him. The way Miss Coyle had always done. The way they'd all finally learned to do. It was clumsy. It was slow. But it was facing him. And that was the only thing the boy had ever wanted. Miss Coyle sat across from him with a cup of coffee going cold, because she was watching him work and forgot it. He had a proper sketchbook now. Someone in town had bought it for him, nobody would say who, real paper, bound, 100 clean pages, and no more butcher paper scraps sharpened with a pocket knife in a cold loft. He was drawing the diner. The counter, the stools, the chrome napkin holders throwing back the light, the men's faces. He drew them looking at him now, which was new, which he was still learning the shape of. Out past the window, where the Hollis Works had stood as a black ruin all winter, a new frame was going up. Fresh yellow lumber against the spring sky. A furniture works again, smaller, honest this time. And on the finish line, the man running it, teaching 2 younger men how to lay a coat even and true, was Del Hutchins. He had his job back, and then some. He waved through the glass when he saw the boy looking, and Eli lifted his pencil to him, which was Eli's kind of wave. 60-odd miles north, on the state farm, Vernon Cade was serving out his years. He is drawing nothing where he is now. He had counted a deaf boy for a blind one, and the boy had been the only one in the whole plant, the whole town, the whole gravel lot of 40 men, who had truly been watching. That's the thing this story leaves you with, if it leaves you anything. The loudest man in the room told everyone the deaf kid wouldn't know a fire from a sunset. And the quietest person in that room turned out to be the only one who was really watching. He couldn't hear a single word they said over him, all those years. So he did the one thing left to him. He looked, and he remembered. And when it mattered, he drew it down exact, and it set a man free. So here's the last thing, before the light goes. Comment the name of someone the world overlooked. Someone nobody faced, nobody asked, nobody thought was watching, who turned out to have seen everything.